Now, what is this question? For me, this question is, how can mind occur in the human mind occur in the physical universe? We now know that the world is governed by physics. We now understand the way biology nestles comfortably within that. The issue is, how will mind do that as well? And the second part of this is, this answer must have the details. I've got to know how the gears clank and how the pistons go and all the rest of that detail. That's that question, Ryan. It's not the same as a bunch of other questions. For instance, it's not the same as what is the nature of intelligence. That is the AI question. And although I have been associated with AI for a large part of my life, that's not the question that drives me. This is the question that drives me, and they're not the same. It's not the Simon question, which is essentially, this is kind of an abbreviated version to get it into a single line. How does bounded rationality explain all of human behavior? It's not the same question as that, although, of course, those questions are close enough so that Herb and I have managed a collaboration for 40 years. But in fact, it leads me, my question leads me down to worry about the architecture. It leads Herb to worry about other areas of human life and how to explain them in terms of bounded rationality. It is also not the issue of the nature, or it's not the issue of the mind-body problem. That's the philosopher's question. Now, they may have the same answer. It may be that the answer to my question and the answer to their question is the same. But it turns out, of course, that my question is a simple scientific question. It may be an ultimate one and hard to get at, but it is a scientific question. And the mind-body is not. It's a philosophical question. And in fact, if the mind-body were cast as a scientific question, all the philosophers would do different things than they now do about it. They'd go up in the laboratory, for instance. But it's also not what is the nature of the brain. That's another question which may have exactly the same answer, mostly because there's really only one answer out there, all right? The same answer, but in fact, if this was the question, I would be doing things very different than the way I'm doing them. Now, you do need to realize, if you haven't before, that there is this sort of collection of ultimate scientific questions, and if you're lucky enough to get grabbed by one of these, that will just do you for the rest of their life. Why does the universe exist? When did it start? What's the nature of life? Why is evolution so stable? All of these things are questions of a depth about the nature of our universe that they can hold you for an entire life, and you're then just a little ways into them. That's not true. There are, in fact, some of these, what is the nature of life, which have been essentially answered compared to where they were 100 years ago. There are some other rather interesting ones in this list, like to see an atom. There were a number of people, not too many, whose real goal in life was to finally see an atom. Having been told by the philosophers that atoms and electrons and all the rest of those things were mere creations of the human mind, they weren't really out there, then what do you want to do? Well, you want to go see one, because if you see one, then in fact you know it's as real as a chair. And that's, of course, happened now, and you probably take it all for granted. So this, in fact, all four of these, well, Herb's question is very interesting, because nobody ever quite posed the question that way before Herb did, whereas all the rest of these are sort of obvious questions. They're just deep questions. So there's the desire. A question that gets asked naturally at that point is, if that's what scientific life is, when did it start? For me, okay? So the maxim here is that the scientific problem chooses you, you don't choose it. You don't go pick a scientific problem and decide that you are going to go and understand the nature of the human mind. For me, it was certainly not the problem at age 17, where what I wanted to be most was a forest ranger. And as a matter of fact, I spent one summer up in the high Sierras being one of those kinds, except what I actually did was to take gangrenous calves' livers, frozen, and chop them up and grind them up so that the trout fingerlings could have something to eat for a summer. Didn't seem like a great career to me. It certainly was not at age 19 when I wanted to be, I say, a scientist. I was out at Bikini at the time That's the place where the atomic bomb testing was done. And in the company of all kinds of scientists and medical doctors and so forth concerned with this, and I was clearly caught up in the excitement, although I hardly knew what it was to be a scientist. But I certainly wanted to be one of those. In fact, I was probably a good example of, I want to work on interesting problems, okay? I suppose that's actually a Chinese scientist. All right. It was not at age 22 when I wanted most of all to be an optical engineer. Now, that's optical engineer. Who would ever want to be an optical engineer? Well, it turns out, as an undergraduate at Stanford, I worked on X-ray microscopy. And most of you think of an X-ray as something which goes through a material, so you can't build a microscope with it. You can't bend the wave. But it turns out that if you take a surface and you shine the X-rays at a glancing angle, you can get enough index of reflection so you can actually focus the X-rays and make an X-ray microscope. And I was all caught up in the engineering and the physics of doing this as an undergraduate for several years, and therefore I clearly wanted to be an optical engineer. It hadn't happened yet at age 27, where what I wanted to be was an organizational scientist. Now, by this time, I actually was a scientist. As John McDermott would say, I actually are one, okay? Because, in fact, we had started to study large social organizations. These were air defense organizations. This was right in the time of the Cold War, and we were studying, there were radar systems all up and down the coast, and we were studying the behavior and performance of those 40-man organizations as they tried to interpret the air picture flowing in as seen through their radars. And I was engaged in organizational experiments, and they were very successful and very interesting. And at that point, I clearly wanted to be an organizational scientist. But it didn't happen then. It actually happened at age 27.7. On a Friday afternoon, and I can't remember quite which Friday it was, but on a Friday afternoon in mid-November, and another fellow by the name of Oliver Selfridge came to Rand. I was at Rand at the time, and he talked about their system. They were producing a system on what was called the memory test computer for Whirlwind, and they were building a pattern recognition system which had several loops of self-adaptation in it. And I listened, and this wasn't a big seminar. He just got in a room with about 3 or 4 of us and described this effort for a couple of hours. And I listened to that, and I knew, okay, this is a genuine conversion experience. I walked out of that place. What I knew actually was that computers can do any kind of complex processing, including learning, abstraction, you name it. That was a sufficient, the collection of mechanisms there were sufficiently rich that we were on our way, okay? It was indeed a conversion experience, and I'm an apostate Christian, so I can tell you I've been through conversion experiences before, and this is one of those. I went into the office of my colleague, Cliff Shaw. We weren't, of course, colleagues on AI at that time, but we had been working together on the simulations that we were doing for this sort of thing, and I repeated verbatim practically what Oliver Selfridge had said in the previous hour. Then I went home that weekend, and I designed a couple of whole systems from scratch, and I've never turned back since, okay? So that's what I mean by saying that the scientific problem chooses you, you don't choose it. I suppose you can say, well, I certainly was engaged in a hell of a search during all of the early years of my life, and I finally came home in that 1 hour. Now, the insight, of course, was not the nature of the human mind. That was already there from the kind of organizational studies. It was that we could understand by mechanistic means how the mind could operate. Now, as I sort of went over this thing, an odd insight's the wrong word, an odd notion occurred to me. This is November 54. That's only about a year and a half before what is usually considered this great burst of activity. The logic theorists, list processing invented and used, GPS, general problem solver, invented and used, the chess program occurred all in the course of a year. That's only about a year away, year and a half away from that thing. And absolutely nothing, if you go back and examine that, presages why this burst of activity should occur. Very compressed in time. So there we are. So there's desire, and we've got it started. Finally got me quitting wandering around and on target. But then there are diversions, okay? And